I think the examples that we have around calling often point to really, really specific ones in the Bible. So I was like, well, God talked to Moses through a bush. Like, why isn't he telling me what to do? Or, we have these really specific examples of a really direct command. And I think that's great. And I think some people get that. And I was always really jealous when it seemed that people did. But it was like, well, if that doesn't happen, then what? And I think that that's where a lot of people wrestle with, especially where God falls into that.
Welcome back to the Form.Life podcast, where we dive deep into the intersection of faith and daily living. I'm your host, Bill Gorman, and joining me as always is my co-host, Paul Brandis.
Yeah, and today we have another fantastic guest with us. Her name's Paige Wiley, and she serves as the Associate Director of Engagement at an organization called Made To Flourish. Made To Flourish is dedicated to helping churches understand and tap into the vocational skills and passions of their congregations.
Yeah, absolutely, Paul. Made To Flourish emerged from its roots at Christ Community as a separate non-for-profit organization carrying forward the leadership and missional essence of Christ Community. It's based here in Kansas City, and Made To Flourish serves on this national scale as a catalyst for pastoral formation and church revitalization.
Yeah, at the core of their mission is they seeking to empower and equip pastors and churches to more faithfully and effectively prepare congregants for their vocational callings beyond the walls of the church. And many of the national staff and board of Made To Flourish originate from Christ Community, including our lead senior pastor, Tom Nelson, who also serves as the founder and one of the leaders of Made To Flourish.
One of the other amazing team members that Made To Flourish is today's guest. Paige is here to share her insights and experiences working with Made To Flourish. She has a unique background growing up in church where work and faith were often seen as separate. But through her college years and various career experiences, she has discovered the deep connection between faith and daily work.
Yeah, and she's passionate about now taking this message to help others, especially students and young adults, to help them navigate this intersection of faith and work. This is such an important conversation, especially in today's fast-paced and ever-changing world. Let's dive in right now. Well, Paige, thanks so much for taking some time to be with us today.
Yeah, excited to be here with
Great
you.
to have you. We've already had some good laughs before we started recording, and
yes.
We've known one another for quite a while, but this is new and fun to get to do this with you, and thank you for taking the time.
Thrilled to be here.
Yeah. So, as you know, you attend our downtown campus, that for a long time, Christ Community has been really taken with this idea of being a church that is even oriented towards helping people in their Monday lives. Church should extend out beyond the boundaries of what happens in a Sunday morning worship gathering, which is deeply important, but actually and measurably and tangibly and genuinely help everyone that comes to that church follow Jesus in all of life. So the way we like to say that is that Christ Community exists to be a church for Monday. And I know you also are compelled by that idea, but kind of in that arena of church existing for more than Sunday morning worship gatherings or even for more than just any programs we might offer, what's your journey there? Like, what's your story of being compelled by that idea?
Yeah. God's so at the center of it. So I grew up in church. I grew up in a context where work and faith were two different things. It kind of came to a head in college when I was deeply involved in both my campus ministry, which was a huge part of my life, huge part of my faith journey. And I also worked at a career center. And so a lot of my work was helping students figure out what they were going to do for the rest of their lives. So this question about calling and about work was on my mind every day, either from my actual work or just I was so curious and fascinated on why do we do the things that we do? Why do we work? What compels us toward certain things? I had students who were super interested in engineering and how that was going to help the world. And I was like, I'm so glad that you are, because I don't get that. I'm not at all.
Right,
exactly.
Yeah.
But those were pretty different parts of my life. And I
segmented almost.
Yes. They were, I was working for a public university and I was involved in a private oriented, campus ministry. So they were very different and separate. And so I wrestled a lot with what is faith and like, how do those connect? Like,
Yeah.
is the idea that we're all becoming pastors? Do we all become missionaries? Like, I didn't really have an avenue for what it would look like to be a really faithful Christian and to work in a space that wasn't a church building. So God took me on a wonderful winding journey through that. I kind of freaked out when I was graduating college because I didn't know what I wanted to do for work. And so I spent a gap year just like jumping around to different jobs, trying to figure it out and find fulfillment in that way. Which was great. I think God was very much in that. But I came back to Kansas City after that and was in the Fellows program. So the Kansas City Fellows was a program designed to help me think about vocation with my faith and how that was connected. It helped me get a job. It helped me get connected at Christ Community. And then ironically, I was placed here for my internship, which is at Made To Flourish, which is all about how faith and work connects to the local church.
And what was that process like? I mean, so just for people that may not know or remember that program, it has sunset in its life here at Christ Community, but for a number of years, we called it the Marketplace Fellows program. It was part of a national program called the Fellows Institute. You can still look them up online and kind of learn about them. And we had a sweet season of offering at that here. You know, that brought you to us. You kind of apply for that. You're a part of this program, and it connects you here at Made To Flourish. What was that process like for you? I mean, even, kind of interviewing and discovering this organization and what Made To Flourish does. Like, kind of take us through all of that. I'm just interested.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I really do mean it when I say God was at the center of it, because I kind of tried to get out of it, or like I didn't really understand it. And so I was placed in this job, but I really was compelled by the people, and I was compelled by the idea of the mission, what I knew about it. But it took about maybe a month or two for me to really understand what we meant when we talked about faith and work.
Yeah.
And I was like, which I always credit all of my coworkers who like let me ask them a bunch of questions for hours on end, because I was like trying to dig into it and I was trying to understand what it meant. At the end of the day, I think my belief was work is part of this necessary evil that we have to do in order to either evangelize to our coworkers or to give our money to the church. And I think working here, again, in God's great laugh and irony, like was the exact place I needed to wrestle through all of those pieces of theology about how work was always part of God's design, how there are so many facets to how and why we are designed for certain types of work. And how the church can be like a center point in making all of that happen. So it was, again, like it took a couple months for me to even understand what it was. But I think once I got it, I really got it and became really interested in how does the church continue this conversation, even like for younger and younger. I needed that, training
That's right.
at a younger age. So
wow, that's amazing.
I remember a paradigm shift, even for me as a church, as we began having some of these conversations a long time ago. Was this shift from viewing work as primarily about compensation and seeing God's design for work as contribution.
Yeah.
So at whatever age and stage, whether you have a paycheck, whether you're earning money for how you spend the majority of your time, that God has created us to contribute in the world, and not just in the local church or not just in missions, but that we love our neighbors and serve them in our everyday vocations and occupations, which is awesome. There's
this really great quote. I think it's by Amy Sherman, where she says, like, God doesn't just care about architects, he cares about architecture and like the expanse of this idea of it's not just the small pocket of like our lives that God wants, like our spiritual parts of us or our like Sunday parts of us, but like he even cares about not only the places that we work, but like the work itself. That was such a huge shift for me that I think lighted something in me that God probably wanted all along.
Yeah. Well, I love all of that, Paige. And just a second ago, you mentioned, I needed that as a college student. I could have used that earlier. And one of your passions and areas of interest is in writing, and you're a gifted writer and have honed that craft. And one of the pieces that you have worked on and kind of think out of that burden to say, how can we help equip people, especially younger in that journey, is a piece called Worked Up, and it's called, the subtitle is Navigating Calling After College. So I'm holding that piece up. If you're watching or if you're listening, you can't see that, but we'll have a link to it in the show notes.
Yes, we will. Yep.
It's a great resource looking at how do we help college students in particular sort of bridge that, okay, I'm in college and what's next after that, and how has God equipped and designed me to contribute in the world, and all of those kinds of things. So I'm just curious, as you worked on that piece, just what was that experience like, and what did you discover about college students and young adults? Obviously, you have your own experience, but you got to talk to and research and think through others' experiences. What were you learning? What questions were people asking? And how do you see the local churches being a part of that conversation?
Yeah. Luke Bobo is the co-author on the book as well. So it was really his brainchild. He tapped me on the shoulder to take part in it, which was very gracious and kind of him to do. But I think the thing that, I needed the resource when I was in college, obviously.
You wrote the resource you needed.
I tried to
write the resource that you needed, 100%.
I felt that there was a gap and a need for, I think, for the discernment of calling, navigating what it is I'm good at and where I can use that. But the title of the book is Worked Up because we also specifically, in my research and my conversations, we're seeing this angle of anxiety.
Yeah.
And I think it's only getting worse. Where it's an anxiety around not only what I'm going to be doing, but I do think it also brushes on this question that gets a bit deeper, which is not only what do I do, but who am I? And I think that question is really what a lot of college students are struggling with, is like, not only what am I going to do for 40 hours a week, which is an important question, but the trends in which we see work tied more and more closely with who we are, I think creates a lot more of that anxiety where people are stunned, like paralyzed with, I don't even know how to react. I don't know what to do with this. When I worked at the Career Center, I met with a lot of people all day long, and I made kind of a mental note that there were students who were anxious all the time. It's a very vulnerable place to come into and to be in. I am here at college. I have no idea what I'm doing. Like, can you help me with that? But the trend that I also noticed was, I think it was like the Christians in front of me that were maybe the most anxious out of everyone that I met with.
Interesting.
You might think is the opposite, right?
You'd hope
it might be the opposite. And so I thought about that a lot. And I think one of the things that I thought through within creating that resource was that it's not only an angle of who am I, what am I going to do, but it's also like, what does God want for me? And if I can't figure that out, that I think brings a whole nother level of shame and anxiety and fear going into the future. And so on the whole, this resource is meant to address not only the practicalities of it, but like also the emotional and spiritual side of making that decision.
Yeah, in some ways, like Paul, you said, like, oh, you would hope that'd be different, but it does make a lot of sense if you have a view that you believe that God exists and that He has a plan for my life. That's sometimes how we talk about it, and I think sometimes that language can kind of cause some anxiety. But like that's God exists, He has a plan for my life, and I've got to figure out what that is. And so if I don't, not am I maybe failing to kind of have my best life, but I'm letting God down.
Exactly.
It reminds me, we talk about sort of the fallacy of how we talk about God's will. And sort of God's will is like the bullseye, or God's will is the X on the treasure map, and kind of these images or metaphors that are getting at, you kind of understand like a slice of why we talk about it that way, but like ultimately it maybe is a little problematic and causes a bit more harm than good, because it can increase stress and anxiety. It's like, man, if I don't get to the end of that treasure hunt and find God's will, or like if God's will is at the very center of that bullseye and I'm just not that good at darts. So I'm gonna miss it, and I'm sure you saw that dynamic in the Career Center. I certainly, my background in student ministries and working directly with college students, I saw that all the time, constantly. Like the anecdotes that I would have, I think probably match with what you saw when Christians came in to the Career Center. So,
Which really, I mean, mirrored my own story too.
Sure.
I never knew what I wanted to do. I still don't, even though I work here, which is great. But like, I just think it's such an odd thing to ask an 18-year-old
Yes.
to start off with is like, what do you want to do with the rest of your life? But then I think the examples that we have around calling often point to really, really specific ones in the Bible. So like, I was like, well, God talked to Moses through a bush. Like, why isn't he telling me what to do? Or, like we have these really specific examples of a really direct command. And I think that's great. And I think some people get that. And I was always really jealous when it seemed that people did. But it was like, well, if that doesn't happen, then what? And I think that that's where a lot of people wrestle with, especially where God falls into that.
Yeah. Well, when you've had a chance to field test some of that, kind of flip it into a bit of a curriculum. So by that, I mean worked up, flip it into a curriculum, embed it with a beta group at our downtown campus, which I think the last number I heard about our downtown campus is 75% what we would classify as young adult. So I'm not sure how many college students. I mean, there's a few colleges sort of near the downtown campus. I'm sure there's some, but certainly a lot of young professionals still. I mean, even like you're saying, I graduated college. I didn't quite know. I took a gap year. I was a young professional. I'm trying to figure it out. So I think that's probably a pretty common story at our downtown campus. So what was that beta group like? Kind of putting some of these concepts, these ideas, this resource out into the wild, so to speak.
Yeah. So the idea was to kind of fill that gap maybe that fellows had been holding for a while of discipleship of young adults after college. What do you do with your life? Like after campus ministry, I think that can be really jarring for some. And so, the idea was just to gather. We called it a cohort so that it felt a little bit more like there was ownership all the way around. But the idea was just to come in and talk about faith and work for a few weeks. And so we talked around the biblical narrative, so the 4-chapter story, how that relates to work. We talked about anxiety. We talked about how to discern a calling. We did some coaching and training in the midst of that. But I think it was cool. You don't typically see a ton of spaces within the church where you can properly discuss your fears and your anxieties and your worries around work specifically. One of the practices that we did was practicing lament. So like, what is broken around work? How do we need to lament anything from like the coffee machine being broken to like big
that's a major thing.
It is. It can be.
Yeah.
or like big systematic things. And so it was designed to be kind of like an embodied practice of some of the things that we wrote about, because words are great, but they need to eventually like change the way in which we live. So hopefully we'll do another session of it someday. But
yeah, you named something there, Paige, the kind of the 4-chapter story around work. And I'm sure some of our listeners who've been around will recognize that 4-chapter language right away. But I'm actually curious, could you just take 60 seconds and walk us through the 4-chapter story of work?
Totally.
I'd love to hear that.
Absolutely. Yep. So the idea is that work falls into the 4-chapter story, and that work was part of God's creation. So before sin entered the world.
So it's kind of the 4-chapter story of the Bible, like the ways that we understand the whole biblical narrative. Right. Yeah.
So the whole Bible can fall into these 4 different chapters of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. So the idea is that work is existent already before the fall. Some people like to think that it might have come after, which I get if you're reading Genesis 3 in itself.
You got to back up a couple chapters.
Exactly. You're coming into the story a little bit late.
Yeah.
We need to back up.
Yep.
So the idea is that work was created to be good in a way that we actually image God. God is himself a worker, and so we get to take part in that. The idea is also that sin had an effect on everything, right? And so that includes work, that includes the brokenness and the toil and the hardship we feel in work these days. Within redemption, we get to see how work is a way of loving and serving our neighbor and seeing these glimpses of heaven. We might not get it fully in the way that we will, in the end days and in the restoration of all things new, but we're like in the midst of this season of already not yet, where it's like we're catching glimpses as we make things right in the way that our work is done, whether that's like in construction or whether that's in education or whether that's in being a retiree and serving your community that way. Like there are all these points in which our work actually takes part in that grand narrative.
and that one day it'll all, it's garden to the city, right? I mean, that's kind of the overarching like place images that we get in Genesis 1 and 2, and then Revelation. And I mean, to get from a garden to a city, there's a lot of work that has to happen, right? But that's kind of that chapter 4 restoration is the city image around that. So, which is really powerful. Yeah. So, and I think people miss a lot of times, like specifically around this kind of idea of receiving and building God's kingdom is something that pastors and missionaries and maybe Christian nonprofit leaders do. Right. It's like, no, like God's taking, his kingdom is going from a garden to the city. Yeah. Right. And there's a whole long story in between of the deep brokenness and, how Jesus fits into all of that as the centerpiece of it. But like, that's the mystery of God at work in the world and in building and sending his kingdom. So, yeah.
It's really good. Yeah. I do think, too, as we continue to think about just this conversation on work and faith and just Christ community congregants, who are kind of the primary folks who are listening to this, we've gone through this skill mapping process that Made to Flourish does. This is one of those things that Made to Flourish does. So I would just even love... Can you talk to us? And that's a big part of your work on Monday, is working with churches doing skill mapping. So I just wonder, could you talk to us? What is skill mapping? We've done that at Christ Community. So some of you may remember this survey that we did a while back in church. We asked you to pull out your phones and answer some questions. But probably others listening, you weren't there that Sunday or you've come since then. So maybe just talk a little bit about skill mapping and... why we do that and what value it is and how have you seen churches take that information and do something with it?
Yeah, so it's pretty simple, really. It's a survey that is meant to help a church vocationally map out who their people are. So the idea is we're asking questions around people's vocations, their occupations, their skill sets, and their passion areas. And then our job is to help a pastor connect that to a couple different integration areas. So, if you know how many accountants you have, what does that mean for discipleship on Monday? Or if you know how many folks have training and teaching and equipping skills, like how do you utilize that during a worship service or so on and so forth? One of the ways that I also just like to frame it is like a good shepherd knows his sheep, right? And so
great.
The skill mapping survey is really meant to just ask folks where they're at, instead of asking to put more on their plate, like what's on your plate? What are you doing? Where are you already on mission? Where are you already serving? Like, what is your story in this little segment of your work? And so, essentially pastors get the chance to use that for their congregations. They get to map out a little bit more of who their people are. And then Made to Flourish helps leverage that, again, within 3 integration areas of the worship, the discipleship, and the outreach.
Yeah, because I know one of the things that Tom Nelson, senior pastor at Christ Community, also helped to start lead Made to Flourish, talks about a lot, is that often pastors spend the majority of their time thinking about where their people spend the minority of their lives, which is that Sunday morning worship service. But the majority of our people's time is spent not in church on Sunday morning, but raising kids and in the workplace and caring for neighborhood HOA board meetings and all those kinds of things that we do. And so I love that idea of a good shepherd knows their sheep. Yeah. And how can we be reminding ourselves that as church leaders, we're really equipping people not just to be good volunteers on Sunday, but for the whole of life. We do need good
volunteers on Sunday.
And as a good pastor, Paul's always going to make sure we remember that, right? Because we do, and that the church is vital. You need a good your Monday needs a good Sunday. Yep. So 100%. If you're not
church gathered. Church scattered. Yep. 100%.
So we 100% need that. But so often pastors haven't thought about the other 167 hours.
Right. Exactly.
And so even just having that data, I know for us at Christ Community, has just been really illuminating.
Well, and for us, so one of the things that specifically came back, and we're eager to, even in this space, share a bit of this. I know our congregants are interested in that data and what did it reveal. And across all campuses, or all 5 locations, this is also specifically true at Shawnee, we have a ton of healthcare workers across industries, so mental health professionals, doctors, nurses, PAs, occupational therapists. I'm going to butcher it, but I have 2 nurse anesthetists who I think I got it right, right?
Yeah,
so
that's good.
Anesthesiologists, but actually it's a different degree that they pursue, similar. They're actually husband and wife that have kind of staggered when they've gone through the same program, which is a really cool thing. They supported one another through the same program. And then we have a ton of teachers. We have a ton of educators. And so we had this data, and like anecdotally, we would have known that, but to like see the numbers was frankly stunning. And so we do these interviews in church service, in our gathered Sunday church service called This Time Tomorrow's, where we're asking about someone's Monday life, someone's Monday work. And when we went to do our last one of those at the Shawnee campus, I have a husband and wife where the wife is a licensed clinical social worker and the husband's a teacher. It's like, well, I'm going to do a This Time Tomorrow interview with both of them.
Yeah.
I'm going to do a couple because it actually tells the story of our congregation and in a powerful way, and not the whole congregation, but again, the data helped us make a Sunday morning decision that hopefully was thoughtful and helpful to a large swath of the congregation. So it's really helpful. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff that we're learning and doing as well. But that was just one example.
Well, and we're kind of still on the front end of this process here at Christ Community, but you've done this with churches across the country at Paige and with the Made to Flourish team. And so I would just even love, as for churches that are further down the road in this vocational skill mapping, both taking the survey and then applying that, what are some stories that you would share about like how have churches grown, changed, things that they've started or tried as a result of this that I don't know. I just would love to hear that.
Yeah. It's really exciting to hear how each church
you just get to travel and like do this stuff.
Yeah.
It's cool. I love that you get to do that.
It's a lot of thinking work. It's just like a lot of. I love that. At the end of the day, it's really about the church and their context and how they're uniquely placed and gifted to serve in a certain way. So. Yeah, I mean, a couple of examples that come to mind. Some churches have been doing This Time Tomorrow interviews at their own services, and so that's like become more of a popular Sunday morning moment where we're seeing more vocations from the front, right? Like whoever is at the front sends a message of who's important, who's part of this church. Who gets platform time. Who gets platform.
That's a big deal. That's right.
So that's been a big deal. Sometimes that is paired with a commissioning moment. So for instance, if it's an educator up there, then pastors are having all of the educators stand at the end of that and then having a sending moment. So, like we might see in a missionary context or a global moment, like we're doing that for the folks that are also in our own communities. Another example, there is a group of churches actually in Central Florida who's taken the skill mapping survey who are working together to create vocational guilds within their churches.
What a great name.
Yeah.
Vocational guild.
Guild sounds really cool.
I want to join it.
Well, gotta go to Florida, but okay.
That's awesome. That's very cool.
Being the idea that like where they see hot spots within their own communities. So like where are there people who are the educators or the healthcare workers that are like the most energy is around that, or entrepreneurs, or maybe it's stay-at-home parents. Like how do they connect the people in similar areas but at different churches in order to either create support groups? Maybe it is to work on projects together. We've heard of folks in the faith and tech industry, like taking on a project together, using their entrepreneurship together. Maybe it's working with certain generational groups or guilds. So it's around like, can you pair some retirees up with folks who are new to their professions? And anyways, using that data in order to kind of group folks together in order to create community and discipleship within those spaces. So there's a lot of other stories that come to mind, but those are a couple of spaces that I'm seeing it happen.
It's amazing. It just gets me so excited for us at Christ Community. And because in so many ways we've had this conversation for a long time, but in some of these practical applications, like I'm just so excited for the ways that we can continue to grow, and having that information, that data about who our congregation is has been so helpful. So it's just so exciting. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, kind of specifically out of that, I know we've maybe mentioned this on a Sunday morning, but, one of the areas that we're looking to maybe focus in coming out of the skills mapping survey as a whole church is kind of where our conversation started, which is the need to drive this conversation further upstream.
Yeah.
So with next gen, like, let's make sure we don't want to lose sight of any of the thirds of life. Actually, we're very passionate about the third of life, and over 50%, we think of our Leawood campus represents that demographic. We've got some great things happening there with Steve Harvey and others in leadership. But man, if you can push this Sunday to Monday integration conversation farther upstream into that first third of life, into our children even, and our young adults, our students. I mean, you and I were part of a project here at Made to Flourish saying, how can we equip youth pastors with a little bit of a field guide for some things that maybe they could do in this space for their youth groups? Because the earlier we get in this idea, with these ideas and this teaching, the less unlearning has to happen. And so we're passionate about that. Still, a lot of that to kind of be developed. We'll probably call on you for some help with some of those projects.
Yes.
I mean, seriously. But there's a little kind of a task force team that I'm leading, and we're just excited about that and passionate about seeing that happen even more impactfully at Christ Community.
Yeah.
So,
well, and we need to probably wrap up soon here, but I just, as kind of like one last question, just as you've thought a lot about this, and you mentioned thinking work, and you are so thoughtful, Paige, just, are there ways that you would encourage our listeners just on how to connect Sunday to Monday? Kind of what else haven't we talked about that you're like, everybody needs to hear this, think about this?
what are the questions that churches don't ask?
Yeah.
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts around work and discernment and calling and all these things. But I think truly the question at the end of the day that people want to know is, like, is God in this with me? Like, is it really going to be okay? Because I think that the question at the end of the day around which career or major do I choose, what do I study in school as a student, should I take this job that makes more money, should I do this job that's going to move me to this location? Like, all of those questions are really, I think, centered around, is God with me in this? You know what I mean? And so I feel like the best thing that I could say in this space is just, like, in my experience, and I have chased after a lot of different jobs. I had, I think, 7 jobs in my first 13 months out of college. So, like, I was trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
But, like, I think the thing that I realized is, like, God truly cares, and he's in it. I like to say that work, we say at Made to Flourish, like, work is worship, but I think that God also cares about getting you into the right places of worship. And that doesn't mean that you're always going to have your dream job. I don't think that work is primarily meant to satisfy us in our, like, fulfillment, but I do think that God really cares. And I see each of our, like, workplace journeys as these maps and stepping stones, like, as a story that God is weaving together, and in the places that we might not even notice it, like, he is still there. And so, I don't know, that's kind of cheesy, but
no, it's not at all.
Well, it's the most profound promise that we get in Psalm 23 is that he's with us.
Even in the darkest valleys.
Yeah. Well, as we do wrap up here, Paige, we always like to ask our guests, actually, a question kind of about work, just to kind of get to know them. And the question that we always ask them is, we're bringing on people to talk about typically what they, in one way or another, what they do for their Monday work, what their expertise, their insight is. And you've done that for us today. And so obviously you're here at Made to Flourish. You're working and helping churches connect faith, work, and economics, equipping pastors to do that work. If you didn't do that work, what's, like, Paige Wiley's, like, dream job? You can just do anything.
I'm struck by she kind of already said she doesn't know.
I know. That's why I'm looking at this, and it's like,
I can't wait for the answer. She's like, I don't know what I want to do. I love it. Oh, okay, yeah.
But sorry. Like, we're total blue sky. There's no, there's
Bill
no country.
Would be a park ranger.
I'd be a park ranger.
I
know. He's got a cool
they don't make
answer.
any money or whatever. But, like, if I could just go do it, I would. That's what I would. I'd love to do. I was an Eagle Scout. What's that? What's that dream thing? You don't. Money's no object.
One of my
You can live anywhere.
joking but kind of serious answers for a while was to be an Uber driver, because I just thought it was such an interesting way to like have these really quick touch points with people and then leave. And then like, it's like, okay, cool. Like served them. And
I feel like we could make that dream come true for you, Paige.
I do. Yeah. My mom wouldn't be thrilled about that, but good. I don't think that's my answer anymore though. I think I was truly at my best, like as a career counselor. If I could do that for a long time,
Yeah.
I would really, I just think that there's such a beauty in the blueprint of a person to get to explore it. So if I could do that forever, I probably would. But I mean, park ranger sounds really cool too.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
I could add research librarian to that list from me too.
Yeah, you definitely could.
It's a good answer.
That's
Okay.
good. Good one.
Paige, thank you so much. We're just so grateful for the work that you're doing and truly the national influence that you have and the ways that you're helping churches around the country connect these dots and doing that for where people spend the majority of their lives and are being formed by Jesus in those spaces. We're just so thankful for you.
We are. And thanks for this time. Thanks for the time. We really appreciate you joining us here.
Yeah. Thank you guys. It's been a lot of fun.
Good. Yeah, thanks for listening and tuning in. We'll have some good show notes for you, including the link to the resource that we mentioned and got to show if you were watching. But thanks for being with us on the Form.Life podcast.